of Côte d'Ivoire's most well-known opposition figures won't be on the ballot for the October 2025 presidential race. Tidjane Thiam, who many saw as a fresh face with his background in banking, was kicked out because he still held French citizenship when he tried to register, something the electoral rule doesn't allow, even though he's since given it up. Now then, there's former President Laurent Gbagbo, along with Charles Blé Goudé and Guillaume Soro, each barred because of past convictions tied to political violence or corruption. For everyday Ivorians, now this feels like more than just a paperwork or legal issue. It's got a lot of people asking whether the deck is being stacked to help the ruling party coast to another victory. Opposition supporters are calling the bans unfair and warning that leaving out so many familiar voices could spark protests or unrest. Now joining us on the conversation this evening, we have Professor Joseph Siegel. He's the Director of Research, Africa Center for Strategic Studies, National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And we also have Daniel Ozoku, Research Fellow, United Nations and International Affairs Institute, Abidjan. We also have joining us Dr. Gnaka Lagoke, Associate Professor of History and Pan-Africana Studies at Lincoln University in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us on the conversation.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Now, let's begin with Professor Siegel. Now, last month, a court removed Tidjane Thiam from the electoral roll because he held dual nationality at the time. How do you assess the strengths of the court's ruling prohibiting dual citizens from both a legal and political standpoint?
Well, from a legal standpoint, it seems that there is a genuine issue in terms of the dual citizenship and that being a potential disqualifying factor. But from a political standpoint, I think it seems from the perspective of many observers that this is just a technicality and that Thiam is a serious candidate. He does have a popular constituency. He's a respected figure politically in economic circles, and that he deserves to be a candidate in the elections. And so I think his case is very different than the others where there have been convictions for various illegality or past political violence from previous elections.
All right, now let's hear from Daniel next. Laurent and Charles Blé Goudé remain ineligible due to convictions, and also Guillaume Soro was convicted in absentia. Do you think that criminal records should be grounds for permanent political exclusion?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Let me underline that democracy is declining in the world, according to the Freedom House report. And with the emergence of authoritarian regimes. So I think that the exclusion of key prominent political leaders such as Tidjane Thiam, Laurent Gbagbo, Blé Goudé is narrowing the democratic process in Côte d'Ivoire. And it suggests a move away from pluralist and inclusive governance. And we can say that we are returning back from the monoparty system that ruled the country since several decades. So the system weakened the legitimacy of our electoral process, and such exclusion risks reinforcing political polarization and public mistrust. They also signal a potential return to winner-take-all politics. Ultimately, democracy becomes fragile when major contenders defined by legal procedural tools.
Now, let's hear, your thoughts, Dr. Lagoke, on all of this, especially the fact that Laurent Gbagbo was barred after being sentenced in absentia to 20 years for alleged looting post-2010 crisis. Do you think that this conviction, in your view, legitimately disqualifies him?
I want to say thank you again to be in your presence. We have to be straight when we talk about the Ivory Coast crisis. For those who did not have the opportunity to follow the crisis has been in force for 30 years. And then Mr. Alassane Ouattara, who supposedly was born in Ivory Coast, had taken nationalities and citizenships from other countries, but particularly that of Burkina Faso or Upper Volta, because his parents were from that place, at least one of them, according to very important sources, and it is even documented. So he was excluded, and then he raised a rebellion to impose his candidacy. And then when there was a crisis, electoral crisis 2010, when he was claiming to be the victor of the election and Gbagbo was claiming to be the winner of the election, the war resumed. And then Mr. Ouattara, with the support of France and the United Nations, resumed to violence in order to fight against Gbagbo's forces and to dislodge Gbagbo, who was taken to the ICC. It was during that crisis that Gbagbo resorted to the nationalization of the Ivorian branch of the West African Central Bank. And this is why Mr. Ouattara's people went after him and they condemned him. So I believe that you cannot suffer from exclusion and then you're going to come and then exclude 4 big names in Ivory Coast politics. So number 2, the reasons that people are using are dubious reasons and they're not credible reasons in order to exclude Gbagbo Laurent, who was acquitted from the International Criminal Court for all those crimes that the government wants to use in order to exclude him from the electoral process. And so, this is my position about that electoral issue in Ivory Coast. So Tidjane Thiam, when we were young, growing up, we saw Tidjane Thiam as an Ivorian. Of course, like many people who go overseas, he took the citizenship of France, and Mr. Ouattara himself definitely may have taken the citizenship of France or the United States, but at least from Burkina Faso. So this is what I think about the situation.
Okay, now let's hear from Professor Siegel. You heard what Dr. Lagoke said. He talked about, devious reasons being used to exclude them, especially Tidjane Thiam. Now, with these 4 high-profile candidates, being excluded, all of them barred, how much room is left for genuine political competition in October?
Yeah, well, I agree that there is a huge irony in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, given that the issue of identity and citizenship was initially used against Ouattara when he was first a candidate. And as I said earlier, I think each of these cases we need to look at individually. And I think the one that's most problematic is with Thiam, who has been a very public and respectable figure and has a strong following in Côte d'Ivoire. And I am concerned that if he is not allowed to run, then it will cast doubts on the validity and legitimacy of the election. And we should keep in mind, we would overshadow much of the genuine progress that has been made in Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire has seen sustained economic growth of 5% a year or so over the last decade. It's made genuine improvements in corruption. It's generally seen as more transparent. And so there's a lot of positive things that have been happening in Côte d'Ivoire, especially relative to the rest of West Africa. And so this, the way that the election is shaping up, and the exclusion of some of these candidates, especially Thiam, I think is dominating the discourse, and that's going to affect how people perceive the election.
All right. Now, Daniel, what about, the over 20 opposition parties that came together, united under the Coalition for Peaceful Alternation? How will the exclusion affect this coalition's cohesion and strategy?
As I observed in Côte d'Ivoire, this coalition wants a peaceful process of the election. So the strategy is to appease the political tensions in the country to avoid what we experienced in 2010. So they want to discuss, to have a conversation, a dialogue with the government. But till today, the government did not accept to discuss with them about the roadblocks of the electoral process. There are legitimate requests and they demand reform of the Independent Electoral Commission and the revision of electoral court. So I think that most of the leaders that are in that coalition want to avoid the polarization and the escalation of the conflicts to preserve lives in the country. So I think that the government, instead of discussing with those people to establish rules, I can say legitimate rules, accepted rules for fair election, government of Ouattara is I can say preparing the war.
Okay. Now, you talked about how the government should have dialogued with the opposition candidates instead of barring them. But then I know that Dr. Olagoke has actually, earlier you helped us understand why Thiam's renunciation of French citizenship from February was not enough to save his candidacy. Now, Thiam has also appealed to the UN Rights Committee, right? How likely is it that an international body could intervene effectively before October 2025?
I understand that, Thiam, first of all, the guest who was the director of the center was talking. It looks like he's making a fixation on Tidjane Thiam. I believe that Tidjane Thiam should not be excluded from the electoral process. He should run. He should be allowed to run. Gbagbo should be allowed to run. And then Blé Goudé should be allowed to run. Soro Guillaume should be allowed to run. We have to be clear on that. That's the first element. The second element, the names of the people that we mentioned are not on the electoral list. And then the second step is going to be when they're going to submit the candidacies in order to run for president. Simone Gbagbo, based on what I know, it looks like a name is on the electoral list. So having her on the electoral list, and then with the exclusion of Tidjane Thiam and Blé Goudé, I think that the intention of the government is to try and create some rift and some tension within the coalition that they put together. That's another element. So it is important for them to do international pressure to lobby the UN, to talk to the partners of Ivory Coast. But the most important thing is to try and change the dynamics on the ground, because it is only when people can put together a people's power movement, like what we saw in Ivory Coast in the past, or particularly what we saw in Senegal 2012 and recently which led to the rise to power of Bassirou Diomaye Faye and Ousmane Sonko in Senegal, or something like what people did in Burkina Faso 2014, that our state bless Compaoré from power. It is only when people can do that, then we can hope to see some credible and transparent elections in Ivory Coast.
Well, Dr. Lagoke, you talked about, submitting the candidate list. Are you saying anything can happen? Because according to reports that we have, the Independent Electoral Commission has finalized the candidate list on June 4th. That's like a few days ago. Are you saying that anything can happen before its submission, or has it already been submitted in this case?
Yeah, so what the information that you have is correct. In their mind, that they're not going to open the electoral list anymore. But what I'm saying is that Gbagbo, Blé Goudé, Soro, and Tidjane Thiam, their names did not appear. But one thing people are not talking about is that it looks like Simone Gbagbo, Gbagbo, the former First Lady, it looks like a name is on the electoral list. People will only open up that electoral list to have Tidjane Thiam name there or Gbagbo's name only if they win the battle of the street. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. Now let's hear from Professor Siegel. How significant, still on this, by the way, on the list, how significant is the date, that's June 4th, where the candidate list was finalized? How significant is that date in the timeline of electoral preparations and immediate legal avenues that remain for these barred figures?
Yeah, well, I think the decision, the latest decision from the court, gives some clarity as the country leads to elections by October. Ideally, this is resolved so that there's some certainty, some predictability around it. And so I think it's understandable from a legal standpoint that these decisions are being made, and they're being made far enough ahead of time. But I think, as we've been saying, politics is also about perception, and legitimacy comes from perception. And if there's a perception among many Ivorians that genuine candidates are not able to compete, that is going to impact the credibility of the election. And so I think from a political process, there is still some space to explore the validity of the exclusions that are out there. I think that's what Thiam's trying to do by appealing to the UN human rights body and trying to bring other forms of pressure onto the government to try and allow for his candidacy. And again, I think what is in the interest of the whole country is that the process is seen as valid and as legitimate, that candidates that citizens are supporting have a right to compete, providing that they have not violated other, major laws in the country or violated other major stipulations of the candidacy. And so I don't think this is the end. I think we'll continue to see some discussion about it, and there may be further court action on the push to have, especially Thiam participating.
Oh, okay. Now, Daniel, let's come back to you, because in all of this, critics have actually pointed to democratic backsliding in the region. The Carter Center raised serious concerns over civil liberty restrictions as well. How valid is that warning in Côte d'Ivoire today?
I wanted to make a precision before
please go ahead.
Answer your question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
In Côte d'Ivoire, the process is that the Electoral Commission can exclude someone from the election because he's sentenced. And there is another process. There is another process with the Constitutional Court. It is the Constitutional Court that can validate, I can say that, the names of those who want to participate in the election. So there is another process that will be that is coming, maybe 1 month or 2 months before the election. So for sure, Tidjane Thiam, Laurent Gbagbo, Blé Goudé, they will send the applications for to compete. So the process is like that. Before that, maybe things may change. So to answer your question, as I said, we know that Côte d'Ivoire experienced I can say the first wave of democratization in 1990s. And after this date, the real genuine election that we had, it is 2010, where all the candidates were allowed to participate. So today, using the kind of legal process to exclude candidates is a huge problem. I think that President Ouattara wants to privatize the electoral process because he wants to select his challengers, as he did in 2020. He selected someone who didn't have a real weight, and today this person is the ambassador somewhere. So he wants to select his candidates, his challengers, and this can frustrate the majority of people because you know that those who are excluded, I can say, constitute the majority of the I can say the electoral, I can say, voters. Yeah.
Okay.
So it can be a huge problem.
Okay. Now, Dr. Lagoke, in 2020, voter turnout was about 53%. So if major opposition figures are absent, what impact do you expect on turnout this time? Could we see a repeat of low participation or even a boycott?
Yeah, of course. There will be low participation for sure if the leaders that we talking about, if they are not allowed to run for president, because so far the conversation we are having, I think Daniel wanted to emphasize that, and I spoke about that. It is that the names that we talk about are not on the electoral list. It means that they cannot even vote. That's the problem that we're having. And now the second step is to see when they submit the candidacies not to run for president. So if your name is not on the list, definitely that Constitutional Council is going to reject the candidacies. So this is going to likely lead to a boycott. It can be an active boycott. It can be a passive boycott of the election. It's going to have an impact on the turnout of the elections. So this is how I see it. And then, I think that the most important thing is for the opposition and the people who care about justice and freedom in Ivory Coast, because democracy is on the retreat in Ivory Coast, and then because people have to take back the country and they have to regain that desire to fight for freedom and justice beyond the elections.
Now, Professor Siegel, let's hear your final thoughts, and also, if you don't mind, let's also touch on the opposition's call for protests and the civil transition. Would you say that has actually gained real momentum? What are also the risks and outcomes if mass demonstrations or protests erupt before or after the election?
I think it's important to keep this in context that Ivory Coast has made great progress in many ways in its electoral processes, in its democratic processes over the past 20 years when it was facing civil war. We've seen more transparency. We've seen more space for independent media. There's more space for civil society. The Electoral Commission itself has done a lot to expand voter registration. So there's a lot of positive things that we should recognize. And so the issue now of the exclusion of candidates threatens to overshadow a lot of that progress. And so I do think it's important to continue to find a favorable resolution that is acceptable to most Ivorians. I think if there are growing protest and that is seen as representing the denial of the will of the general public, that is going to have implications for Côte d'Ivoire. And again, we all remember the conflict and the violence that the country experienced, and that the real risk is that we go back to some of that instability, and that would really undercut so much of the real gains and the real progress that has been made in Côte d'Ivoire. And so I think it is important that this gets resolved, and therefore the election can proceed in what otherwise has been some positive developments in the country.
Okay. Well, we would actually have to wrap up this discussion right now, but we really appreciate you gentlemen for your time and for speaking to us on this. Professor Joseph Siegel, Director of Research, Africa Center for Strategic Studies, National Defense University in Washington, D.C., Daniel Zuku, a Research Fellow, United Nations and International Affairs Institute in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and Dr. Naka Lagoke, Associate Professor of History and Pan-Africanist Studies at Lincoln University, Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.